My point is that they were totally incorrect at Abu Dhabi, and they should have finished that race behind a safety car. And for all the people out there who say, oh, Formula One races should always finish as a sprint, regardless, I would reiterate what I've said several times on my YouTube channel and on Twitch, which is that I think any TV director stroke commentator who couldn't have brought tears to everybody's eyes as Lewis Hamilton was driving that last lap at Abu Dhabi behind the safety car, waving to the crowd, fireworks going off under the night sky, having just broken Michael Schumacher's record. Anybody that couldn't have made that moment work for posterity and in the history of Formula One shouldn't be in the job in the first place. But my perspective is safety is the most important thing. You know, I'm probably been around a little bit longer than most people. I went to 15 funerals by the time I was 30. And most of them were young kids my age who died in Formula One cars. And so anything that enhances safety, I'm always 100% behind it. And I think it would have been dangerous to have restarted at Monza while they're still putting Daniel's car to rest behind the guardrail. Yeah, you only have to think back to Imola and that shunt that George had with Valtteri Bottas to see how, or indeed to Jerez in the GP3 finale when George effectively T-bone Jack Aitken out of the
Yes.
You know, you've only got to look at those things to see that George is not going to give 1 millimeter if there's a chance of winning a Grand Prix or a World Championship. Carlos is a great guy, very good racing driver, and he's a perfect other driver for Ferrari alongside a superstar like Charles Leclerc. But Charles Leclerc needs to be given the space in which to operate, and he doesn't need to feel that he's got to look over his shoulder all the time. And at the moment, I still think there's quite a lot of that going on. So I'd make that point very clearly as well. And I'd sort of say, look, anybody who's not in here to support what we're doing with Charles Leclerc, leave now.
Mr. Windsor, friend of the channel, thank you so much for coming back on the F1 Hour. I appreciate you as always, ad infinitum, if I can even get my words out. Again, award-winning broadcaster, World Championship winning team manager. I appreciate you, sir. How are you keeping?
I'm good, mate. And you? Good to see you again. Thanks for having me on.
No. The pleasure and the gratitude is all this end, Peter. And by the way, peddlers, do me a favour. Go and subscribe to Peter Windsor on YouTube if you're not already. And straight after that, in short order, go and look at some of the long form soliloquy, Peter Windsor on Twitch. If you're not already on there, what are you doing? Peter, can we talk some F1?
Thanks, mate.
I wanna talk to you about Monza. Talk to me about this red flag situation, because it's not been greeted very well by those guys and gals on Twitter, F1 Twitter. Again, so short in the memory and so fresh in the mind of the wounds of Abu Dhabi. Were they right in the first instance, Peter, to end the race under safety car conditions at Monza, again with Abu Dhabi still so fresh in the mind?
Well, I think, as you say, with Abu Dhabi fresh in everybody's minds, it's not surprising that a lot of people are angry and annoyed after Monza, because what we saw at Monza was what didn't happen at Abu Dhabi. At Abu Dhabi, they thought, right, forget the rules, forget about anything else. Let's just make sure this race finishes as a race, and we'll forget all that business of the cars unlapping themselves, and we'll just go for it. It doesn't really matter that Lewis is on the wrong tires. Let's just have a race. And on the basis of that, you'd think, well, at Monza, if they did that at Abu Dhabi, at Monza, they could quite easily have restarted the race while they were still pushing Daniel's car back into that space. I mean, the problem was obviously they couldn't get it out of gear. So on that basis, you'd say, yeah, people are entitled to feel robbed. But of course, what happened after Abu Dhabi is that all the do-gooders of the world and the powers that be said, well, this is horrendous and massive mistakes were made. This must never happen again. And from now on, we must follow the rule book to the letter. And that's what they did at Monza. So, you know, this was the time to complain about. This was not after Monza, it was after Abu Dhabi, and not enough complaints were made after Abu Dhabi. They should have, I think, given the World Championship to Lewis, and I think they should have said that last lap was completely illegal, should not have been allowed, and we're going to give the results as they were behind the safety car, and that's what should have happened. And because they didn't do that, that's why we have all this stuff now of people feeling robbed or not robbed, or it was safe or it wasn't safe. Not obviously, but my perspective is safety is the most important thing. You know, I'm probably been around a little bit longer than most people. I went to 15 funerals by the time I was 30, and most of them were young kids my age who died in Formula One cars. And so anything that enhances safety, I'm always 100% behind it. And I think it would have been dangerous to have restarted at Monza while they're still putting Daniel's car to rest behind the guardrail. I don't see there's any discussion about that, to be honest. And I think it did absolutely correctly. My point is that they were totally incorrect at Abu Dhabi, and they should have finished that race behind a safety car. And for all the people out there who say, oh, Formula One races should always finish as a sprint, regardless, I would reiterate what I've said several times on my YouTube channel and on Twitch, which is that I think any TV director stroke commentator who couldn't have brought tears to everybody's eyes as Lewis Hamilton was driving that last lap at Abu Dhabi behind the safety car, waving to the crowd, fireworks going off under the night sky, having just broken Michael Schumacher's record. Anybody that couldn't have made that moment work for posterity and in the history of Formula One shouldn't be in the job in the first place. So I mean, I think not only do I think it was wrong to finish as a race at Abu Dhabi, I think Formula One missed a massive opportunity to create one of the most emotionally charged moments in the history of its sport.
Wow. Love that, Peter. Absolutely love that. Incredible, as per usual. Go on then. I'm going to talk to you. You've segued onto my second question very succinctly and concisely. Mercedes. So you spoke, the last time we talked, you spoke about the team orders or lack thereof, and how ultimately at some point that's going to cost the Silver Arrows team. Do you think then, as at the 14th of the 9th, 2022, that Mercedes are at risk of pushing Sir Lewis Hamilton away, who many people speculated was on the brink of retirement at the end of last season had he won it, because of them almost playing too nice, Peter, the no team orders that you spoke to, the poor team strategy, and almost doing everything that Red Bull are not, right?
Yeah, I think Lewis, I think he's done a really good job of keeping all his emotions under control and under the surface ever since Abu Dhabi. And obviously Abu Dhabi was as big a thing that any racing driver ever has had to put up with, really, if you think about it, just based on that one race. I mean, he drove superbly in that race. He won that race, and it came down to a showdown. Championships are not won and lost in one race, but if they result in a showdown Grand Prix at the end of the season, that is therefore by definition the deciding race, and he won it, except it was taken away from him. So that was the first thing. And then I don't think Mercedes fought hard enough to get the points reinstated for Lewis. I think they kind of gave up, partly because they just gave up, and partly because they're a large manufacturer with a corporate board, they don't want to be involved too much controversy. So I think it was that. And then he wanted to keep Valtteri, quite clearly, not because he thinks Valtteri is a quicker driver than George Russell. On the contrary, he could see that, without saying it too obviously, that having a balanced team like Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, is a logical thing for a team if you want to have harmony and balance. And that was disregarded as well, and they signed George. And then the new car hit the road, and it was a dog. So there's a lot to put up with there. And then he's got this really hard charger who's really good in traffic in the other car, and Lewis has to start relearning all over again what it's like to start P12 and avoid the first corner accident and all that stuff. Not kind of which he'd grown out of, you would have said. And all that's there under the surface, and he's kept it under control. I think Zandvoort was a bit of a turning point, because that was, a lot of people have said, Lewis is a racing driver. He should know that, he should be on the soft. He should force the issue. But the point was not that Lewis didn't have the nous to switch to softs. It was that not only had they agreed before the race that in that situation, both drivers would remain out there to the benefit of track position, and then it would be more difficult for Max to pass two of them rather than one. But also, when Lewis was coming down the pit lane, they quite clearly said to him, stay out, stay out, stay out. And that, that's not what they said to George. George, as he came in, said, I'm coming in, these mediums are going off, I've got to be on softs. And they just sort of said, right, bang, straight in. So you can't criticize Lewis for staying out, I don't think, at all. But the upshot of that, of course, is that Lewis now, I think, more than ever has to look alongside him or behind him at George as much as he does looking ahead of him, trying to go forward. And that's not good use of Lewis Hamilton, for sure. And I come back to my other point, which is if you've got Lewis, you don't need George in the other car. And if you've got George, you don't need Lewis. If you've got Lewis, you should have Valtteri Bottas or, I don't know, Nick de Vries. The same with George. You got George, had Nick de Vries, but don't put Lewis there. And at the moment, it's kind of controllable in terms of two guys on the racetrack because they're not fighting for wins, really. And they're certainly not fighting for the World Championship. But if you imagine what it might be like if Mercedes, for whatever reason, have a car that's 0.3 average a lap quicker than a Red Bull or a Ferrari next year, and it is a championship winning car, can you imagine what it's going to be like? George and Lewis? That's when it's an issue. And then, all Toto Wolff will do is throw his hands up, as Christian Horner did when he had Vettel and Webber, and say, race each other hard, no team orders, but don't run into one another, which is, a fatuous comment. And that's what will happen. And so from Lewis's point of view, now, given all of that, it's either, next year's either another year of more of the same, maybe a little bit better, or potentially, knowing Mercedes, they might have a great car, but then it's going to be massive aggravation anyway. So, and it's not even the same as Nico, who he knew for a long time, and they kind of understood one another. This is a different deal altogether. And you only have to think back to Imola and that shunt that George had with Valtteri Bottas to see how, or indeed to Jerez in the GP3 finale when George effectively T-boned Jack Aitken out of the
Yes.
You've only got to look at those things to see that George is not going to give 1 millimeter if there's a chance of winning a Grand Prix or a World Championship.
Absolutely.
And why should he? He's a hard, fast, very, very good racing driver. But the point is, did Mercedes do the right thing to hire this guy? Bearing in mind their prized possession, Lewis Hamilton, had said, no, I'd rather keep Valtteri, and they overruled that. So anyway, that's where we're at with Lewis. And to me, I'm shocked and surprised that he's driving as well as he is. I'm absolutely amazed that he's done such a good job this year. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he does say, do I really need this?
I've had enough. Peter, I've heard this. This is kind of rearing its ugly head on Reddit as a theory that Lewis at 37 years old has now past the zenith of his career, that F1 is a young man's game, and that we're seeing that borne out with the odd bad strategic call from Sir Lewis, the mistake with Alonso, trying to go around the outside when that was probably a bit of a dodgy manoeuvre to do, the uncharacteristic mistake that we saw earlier, I want to say it was Austria qualifying. Is this proof positive then that Sir Lewis's best days might, controversially, Peter, be behind him?
No, I don't think so. I mean, physically, it's a known fact that an athlete is at his peak when he's 19. So, most of the Formula One drivers are past that. Not all, but most. That's the first point. And I think in Lewis's case, you have to put him alongside other multi-world champions and see how magically he's been able to retain his motivation, whereas others have always lost it. With more fame, with more money, with more success has come a certain laziness. I mean, for Daniel Ricciardo, it happened even before he won a world championship. So I think, Lewis has shown that he's not subject to that. So the only question then is physically whether he's less able to do the job that he did, say, 5 years ago. And there's no sign of that. There's plenty of history of Grand Prix drivers winning world championships in their 40s. And I think it can happen again. And with Lewis, I think he's absolutely capable of winning a world championship next year. And for anybody to say that he's in any way going downhill, I think is, it's just clickbait, really. It's not real.
Premature, fair play. Go on then, Peter. Talk to me about Red Bull and their dominance. I keep having the back and forth with my mates about whether the largest portion of Red Bull and Max's dominance in 2022 is attributable to Max or RB18. Obviously, they've both been absolutely fantastic and rarely making a mistake this season. But which of the two, Max or the RB18, are you attributing the largest portion of the Red Bull success this year to?
Well, I don't really look at it that way. I think as a general rule, it's 60% car, 40% driver when a Grand Prix is won. But having said that, a very, very good driver like Max or Lewis or Charles can take a car from the midfield and do more with it over a period of time than just very good Formula One drivers. And so obviously in that sense, how do you quantify the quality of Max's inputs? And I don't mean his verbal inputs, I mean the inputs of his hands and his feet. And that's something that has been given Adrian and the team a linear growth in terms of development of the car. And you see that now. You've seen it since the August break, since the technical directive came into play. Red Bull, contrary to what I think most of the media people out there, and probably therefore a lot of the fans thought, were not affected at all by the technical directive. In other words, their floor hadn't been flexing, and that wasn't the reason they were quick, which to me was obvious in the first place. So instead, they've just been doing incremental, logical, normal development on the car, saving weight here, stiffening it up there, getting a little bit more aero efficiency in this section, and so forth. Everything that you do during the course of a year. And that's what's happening. And in the meantime, Max, with the World Championship behind him, bit of a monkey off his shoulder, is more relaxed. He's learning all the time. He hasn't lost his ability to be self-critical. He's becoming a more and more rounded driver all the time. He's much better in defense than he used to be. The only area you could say this year where he's lacked is his ability to put the power down in a linear way out of slow corners. And that's why Perez beat him at Monaco. And I think it's pretty clear that he's learned a lot from that. And I'm fascinated to see how he goes at Singapore alongside Perez, because this should be the next really good circuit for Perez. And after that, I don't know, somewhere like Brazil, maybe. I mean, he'll fly in Mexico for sure, but putting that to one side, Brazil maybe. But this is going to be a real acid test, I think, for Max's own little world of performance relative to his teammate. It'll be really interesting to see how he goes in Singapore, because, you know, Sergio should be very quick there. We haven't had too many circuits recently in which Perez can be Sergio Perez. They've been sort of medium, high-speed corners, high-speed braking, none of which is his forte. But getting the car nice and linear out of slow corners is what he does really well. And that'll, you know, if you're Max, you'd be self-critical about what happened at Monaco, and you'd want to make sure that doesn't happen again. But apart from that, yeah, he's been absolutely on it. But a lot of that is, you know, it's Adrian Newey, and it's also Adrian's ability, I think, contrary again to what quite a lot of observers have said, to get on top of the engine program too, and to get Honda really organized. I say Honda, the program they've now got based on Honda engines, really organized and running as the way it should run, and should have run at McLaren even. And Adrian does that. So it's untrue to say that Adrian couldn't do an engine program, because he's doing an engine program right now, and you can see the results. The only question will be whether Adrian continues. So that's the only thing in the future, I think, of Red Bull that you need to question. So long as Adrian's there, being Adrian, they're going to be in great shape. It's interesting that the Porsche deal seems to have collapsed, and that's no surprise to me, because if you look at the history of Porsche in Formula One, they came in, won a Grand Prix, and then got out very quickly, a bit scared back in the early 60s about the cost. Then they came in again on the basis that McLaren and Mansur Ojeh would underwrite all the costs of that turbo engine in 1981, going through into 83, 84. And they won championships 4, 5, and 6. But it was all financed outside. They didn't spend 1 cent on it themselves, Porsche that is. And then when they came in again with Jackie Oliver and the Arrows, that was very shoestring. You know, I think Jackie felt in his usual way, you know, if I can keep all the balls in the air and get this thing going, it'll be a good engine. And somewhere along the line, I'll get footwork or someone to sponsor it. And of course, it never really happened, and it was a mess. And now Porsche for sure are saying, yeah, we'll do an engine for you, but who's paying for it? And I imagine they felt Red Bull would underwrite it, but I imagine, I'm only guessing here, but I imagine Dietrich Mateschitz said, well, we've got a great engine program at the moment, which is costing a fortune, but it's worth it because we're winning races and championships. What you're suggesting, Christian, is that we throw all this down the toilet and start with a completely new engine that may or may not be successful, for even more money, because probably Porsche should be more expensive than what they're doing.
Absolutely.
And the answer was, of course, well, no, that ain't going to work. Let's continue to do what we do, and we know what we're doing. And that makes a lot more sense to me. I mean, the Porsche brand is a nice brand, but in order to finance that engine, you'd probably have to rebrand the covers anyway of it and call it something else, you know. So Yeah, that's no surprise. And I think, it's an interesting point. I know you're not asking me this question, but it's an interesting point about Formula One is jumping up and down about the arrival of Audi. And if you read superficially the press releases, it suggests that Audi's coming into Formula One with a team, but they're not. They're coming in as an engine supplier. So it's not that big a deal. I mean, Peugeot have been in with an engine supplier quite recently. Who remembered them? And I think, there's a bit too much emphasis on trying to get these manufacturers to come in as engine suppliers. And wouldn't it be great if we could get them to come in as teams? That would be a different story, because that's not going to happen in a hurry, because all the incumbent Formula One teams don't want any more Formula One teams on the grid, because it'll take a bit away their slice of their cake. So why would they want that?
And that's a fairly big cake if you're currently at.
Well, it's a big cake, but it's a big slice. It's only 10 teams, and it used to be 13 teams. So they're getting very large slices of a very large cake, and as a result, they don't want to have to make those slices any smaller. They want the Audis and the Porsches to come in and give them free engines. That's what they want.
Oh, yep. Have your cake and eat it, Peter.
Oh, yeah, good point.
So listen, as we round third base, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'll do a couple quick fire, because loads of my subscribers are keen to get those in. Ferrari, cacophony of errors is the best way that I can summarise what we've seen from them, and both driver and operationally, right? Peter, as a World Championship winning team manager, let's hypothesize that you replace Mattia Binotto. What's your first action, Peter, at Scuderia Ferrari?
Well, I would put Mattia back into the engine program, because I think he does a pretty good job there. So that's the first thing I'd do. I don't know. I'd see how much money I could get out of Philip Morris to pay for Adrian Newey to cross the channel, I suppose. And on the basis that doesn't happen, I'd then look around. I'd chat to quite a lot of my mates there and see what they thought. There's a few engineers out there that I think could do a pretty good job at Ferrari, but I don't think the problem is the car, to be honest. I think it's more managerial.
Yes.
I would certainly sit down with the strategy team, and I wouldn't be that critical of them, because I'm sure that they're no better or worse than most F1 strategy teams out there. They're very good with their simulations, very good with their analysis. But I would definitely have a different hierarchy of decision making, and it would end up with the buck stopping with me, if I am in that position. And it sounds pompous to say that, but you did say if I was in that position. Yeah, I would say, right, this is what the strategy people think we should do. This is what the performance engineers think we should do. This is what we are doing. And I don't think they've got that at the moment. I think at the moment they've got a strategy team saying this is what we think you should do. And then as a result of Hungary, where quite clearly Charles should have extended his stint and shouldn't have gone to hards, they over the August break, quite clearly, the way they've tried to solve that problem is to say to Charles, okay, from now on, we'll involve you in all the decision making.
Bonkers, Peter.
Which has gone the other way now, because you're a racing driver. You're not a strategist. You're a racing driver, but you've also got a brain, and you know roughly what you should be doing and what the tires feel like. But you shouldn't be called on for every decision now. What do you think, Charles? How you feel?
Unbelievable.
And it's gone the other way. It's like a garden party now. Everywhere, and that's not right either. So you've got to be very, very, cut and dried at what you're doing. I tell you what, I'd probably try and lure Jonathan Wheatley from Red Bull over to Ferrari. I guess that would be one guy. But there are plenty of others. But yeah, you've got to be firm. You've got to be solid. But you can't be firm and solid unless you know the music in the first place. And if you're calling Charles Leclerc in at Monaco when the track's drying and you put him on another set of intermediates, you obviously don't have any feel for the music. You can't sing in tune even. So you've got to make sure all those fundamentals are right before you can make these hard and fast decisions. But to me, it's that really more than anything else. And I would also clear up the sort of slightly grey area around Charles Leclerc, because there's still a lot of pro Carlos Sainz, anti-Leclerc stuff going on at Ferrari and with the media, and that needs to stop. There's nothing. I mean, Carlos is a great guy, very good racing driver, and he's a perfect other driver for Ferrari alongside a superstar like Charles Leclerc. But Charles Leclerc needs to be given the space in which to operate, and he doesn't need to feel that he's got to look over his shoulder all the time. And at the moment, I still think there's quite a lot of that going on. So I'd make that point very clearly as well. And I'd sort of say, look, anybody who's not in here to support what we're doing with Charles Leclerc, leave now. I'd be quite tough about that.
Let's go.
But otherwise, I think, mechanically, chassis-wise, engine-wise, they're not doing too badly. They're doing okay, really, considering all the things that are going on. The question really is how well they will adapt to the next engine regulation. There's no doubt Mercedes, and I presume Honda, Red Bull will do a brilliant job as they become more and more electrified, because that's what they do, really, isn't it? Whether Renault are going to be as good as that is an open question, and whether Ferrari have the ability to do as good a job with electrification is another open question. So, right now you'd have to say the new regs, Mercedes must be pretty happy with those, I would have thought.
Absolutely, Peter. I'm going to ask you, listen, you've been more than gracious with your time already, and I'm conscious that I'm running over. I'm going to ask you a couple of quick fire courtesy of some of my subscribers and members. Ben Turner asks, what's your opinion on Jamie Chadwick and his W Series genuinely, realistically a stepping stone into F1 or other upper echelon motorsport series?
I've got a lot of respect for Jamie. Very nice person. Had a few chats with her. Don't really know her, but watched her drive and chatted to her, interviewed her once or twice. I was a bit disappointed, actually, to be honest, after her first win, that she didn't take the money and spend that on then, racing in the real world, maybe Indy Lights, something like that. If I'd been managing Jamie after that first championship win, and it's not often that A, you get a free drive, and B, a big cash prize if you win a championship. And it's probably the only championship in the world outside NASCAR now, probably. I don't know. Anyway, I would have said to her, right, 45 days with Rob Wilson, and you're doing Indy Lights, and you're going to become a superstar in the United States. You're going to get you into IndyCar. I'm sure we can do a deal where you don't have to do ovals if you don't want to do them. Let's go for it. Instead of which, she just went into another season again. And I think that was, you have to question that, really. And that disappointed me. I'd love to have seen her out there, risking everything at that point to take the next step. So that's that. And I think that to the backdrop of Tatiana Calderon, who's been racing Japanese Super Formula, LMP2, I think, and IndyCar. And sometimes she does a pretty good job. And she did a good job in Formula 3 when she first set out. She's back in F2 now. And, I think she should be taken, of all the female drivers in the world, she's the one that we should take most seriously, I think, because she's out there racing on those platforms and doing a pretty good job, all in all. I think, obviously, it's very difficult. She's in incredibly difficult categories in very difficult racing cars.
Absolutely.
All of them. And that needs to be taken into account. But when we're talking about females in Formula One, I think she should be the case study of how we can either improve things or celebrate them and, get more in there.
Absolutely, mate. Maria says, will the FIA, or do you think the FIA will make changes to the regs for next year to prevent further Red Bull domination?
No, I don't think this FIA is, it's all about visibility now, liberty ownership of Formula One. And I think for the FIA to come up with rules that would deliberately hurt Red Bull would be, and thus risk Dietrich Mateschitz saying, right, I'm pulling out of motorsport completely.
Yeah,
I don't think that would happen. So no, I don't think that would happen at all. And I think what did happen is that the FIA went off with a pretty half-cocked technical directive before the Canadian Grand Prix, in which they suggested that they were going to be changing the rules in the middle of the year. And that got a very quick response from not only Red Bull, but some of the other teams as well. And they quickly backed away from that. So rather than what we're doing is reinforcing what we have, and we'll just increase the policing of the vertical oscillation, which we didn't anticipate at the start of the year, which all the teams were comfortable with. And as we've seen, Red Bull were not in a problem anyway. And all it's done is enhance the quality of their aero efficiency anyway. for next year, we know what's going to happen. We know that there are going to be changes to the effect of the Venturi, if you like. And that's enough time being given for that. And believe me, there's enough time there for Adrian Newey to come up with a good solution to that new set of regs as well.
Absolutely, mate. And then finally, I think more complete driver. This is super quick. I think I know your answer to this one. More complete driver: Sebastian Vettel in 2013 or Max Verstappen in 2022?
Oh, Max, for sure. I think Vettel was very. It was a perfect storm for Vettel, the way he drives and continues to drive with that sort of V approach he has. And he's really good at it. When he's got a great back end on the car, and it's the right sort of corner. He's really good.
Peter, what do you mean by V approach? Because I think I know exactly what you mean as far as your entry into the corner.
Okay. A V approach is really literally a straight line into a very slow rotation point mid corner, but it doesn't always apply to long corners, of course. I mean, long corners might just be line locked, especially if they've got a bit of camber. But let's assume it's I would call it turn 11 at Barcelona, but I think it's probably 12 now, the long right-hander at the top of the hill there. That's a perfect corner for Sebastian Vettel to go in, brake really late, because he's turning the wheel while he's still flat, when a lot of others might still be, whereas Carlos Sainz would be starting to brake there and look for a sort of wide entry into the corner. He's turning the wheel slightly, braking later into a very slow rotation point. That rotation point, he needs a really good back end on the car. Otherwise, he's going to lose a massive amount of time with understeer. And if he's got a good back end, he can just get on top of it and get the traction and go. And that is contrary to the way Max Verstappen drives, which is not to brake in a straight line. He brakes when he's turning, but he's turning into a much earlier apex than, say, Carlos Sainz. What Max does, if you like, is much more sophisticated, because he's braking while he's got cornering load, whereas Vettel is braking when the car's still more or less straight. It's got slight angle on it relative to the straight, but he's still holding the steering straight. Max is actually increasing the steering load as he's braking, but he's balancing the front of the car, the slide, by the rate at which he's coming out of the brake pedal pressure against the increased steering load. And that's the skill. And that's what Lewis does, and that's what Charles does. I think George kind of does it a little bit, and I think Lando does it a little bit, but nothing like the same extent as, say, Max. But what Lando and George have are very, very supple, particularly Lando, very supple inputs. He's very soft in everything he does, foot application, hand application. Anyway, getting back to the point. So what Max does is he has the benefit of what Vettel does when the corner's right. In other words, quite an early corner entry. And if you've got an early corner entry and you're not sort of braking in a straight line on the outside and waiting for the moment when you can load up the rear to a geometrical apex, which is the sort of classic racing line, Carlos Sainz racing line, Sergio Perez to some extent. That's using a lot more physical road apart from anything else. That's why we talk about long corners, because it's actually making the corner longer than it needs to be. And I've said several times, if you were to put a sort of white trail of paint under the car, a bit like the things they use to do the white road markings on the road, and you had one under Max's car and one under, let's say Sergio Perez's car, over a lap of Barcelona, probably Max's lap would be several meters shorter. And that is then multiplied by whatever it is, 67 laps. And that also means less energy going through the tires. If you're doing it correctly, it's very, very easy to do what Max does and then lock an inside front or run a bit wide mid-corner, have understeer, as you see a lot of drivers. See, one of the places where it's actually almost impossible not to try to do what Max does is into turn 10 in Bahrain, because it lends itself there, because it's a fast approach with a left-hand kink, and then you've got to brake hard into that tight left-hander. So it lends itself, if you like, into sort of turning in early on the brakes. Look how many guys lock up the inside front there and run wide into 10. Those are the guys that normally never do that, but they're kind of invited to do it because of the way the corner's shaped. And again, that's not a great corner for Sebastian Vettel. But there are quite a lot. I'm trying to think, let's think Singapore. Are there any sort of Vettel-like corners in Singapore? I don't think there are, actually. I don't think Singapore is a circuit where you could say there's a corner there that's really good for Sebastian Vettel. I'm not saying, therefore, he's hopeless. What I'm saying is, when you come to a circuit, or when you're on a corner that isn't a corner, he can really do what he does well, V the corner in a really precise way. And when he does that really well, because he does it more than anybody else anyway. He then becomes effectively just a sort of Mark Webber. He's just a very good racing driver. He's not a bad racing driver by any means, but he's just an averagely good racing driver until he's in one of these corners where he can really do what he does well. And I don't think he knows that. I don't think he realizes that. I think and why would he? He's at 1 meter and observers are at 30,000 feet. So it's slightly easier if you're at the top to look down and see what's going on. But I think the staggering thing, if I can just finish overall, is how little the drivers these days actually look at what the other drivers are doing. And
I remember you said
from them. They're so inwardly focused that the only thing they relate to is their teammate and their own data. And it's quite difficult. It's increasingly difficult, I think, with the increasing amount of data that they're confronted with, to be self-critical in an objective way. And that's one of the problems. And I think that's why we saw at Monza, Charles Leclerc and George Russell specifically doing a superb job out of Ascari on the approach to Parabolica. And nobody else really doing it that well. And it begs the question of why Carlos Sainz wouldn't have been looking at Charles Leclerc at some point and saying, why is he doing that? I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to stay close to the the white line for as long as I can and then go across. But it never occurred to them. And that can only be because they're not watching what other drivers are doing. And if they're not watching what other drivers are doing and learning, then they're missing out on something. And that's pretty systematic of Formula One, really, isn't it? The amount of data that's floating around. Everybody just lives in their own world. And it first struck me, actually, when I was talking to Mark Webber in the Red Bull days. And we were at Melbourne, and he was not doing it was mid corner. It was the first chicane, and Vettel was sort of getting lock on about half a meter earlier than mid corner lock, positive lock, earlier than Mark. And I said, it's quite cool what he's doing there, because he's only in a position to do that because of how he's going into turn into the first part, the right-hander. And instead of saying, yeah, it's quite interesting, he said, oh, no, that's only because I'm running a different diff setting.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, well, probably it all adds up when you put all the numbers together, but it's only adding up because they want it to add up, if you see what I mean. And I think that's where perhaps Mark didn't, close that final gap to Vettel when Vettel was really on it. But that's where the difference was. There's too much data floating around, too many other things to blame, if that's the right word. And I think that's been expanded with the increase, and there's more data now than there was then, for sure, and it's even worse now.
Absolutely. Mr. Windsor, when you get like that, I love it when you start talking about steering angles and the difference between two drivers. I love it. Incredible, mate. I will ask you this final one because, again, I've run massively over my time. Elliot says, I think I know your answer to this one already. Elliot says, have the regs taken away from the art of attacking, defending? Is it now too easy for the faster car and driver combo to win from anywhere on the grid?
Well, it's never been difficult. If you've got a big car advantage and you're a very quick racing driver, it's never been that difficult to win from the middle of the grid or the back of the grid. Obviously, some circuits you can't overtake. I mean, Alonso stuck behind Petrov at Abu Dhabi, I guess, is a good example. But yeah. I think in general, it's always, but I know where you're coming from with the question. I think it's time to get rid of DRS myself. I think these cars, you can follow a bit closer. And I think we've seen on a lot of the new circuits, because it's probably a bit cheaper to build them that way, and because of space, they all seem to feature sort of Baku-like long straights with chicanes or slow corners at the end of them. And if we're going to go in that direction, even less reason for DRS, because not only do you not need it, but it's actually quite dangerous because the speed differential is absurd. Yeah. So I think it's time to get rid of DRS would be my thing. And we saw Max's pass at Zandvoort, that was not a DRS pass on Lewis. And so I think there's that. I think if you really wanted to have, and many people will say, well, this will never happen, and of course it won't, but if you really wanted to have more overtaking, then you'd get rid of all the current transmission systems and you'd go back to a conventional old style H pattern gearbox with a foot clutch, and you'd let the drivers make mistakes on gear changing, and that would be your opportunity to overtake. And would bring back one of the skills and arts of Grand Prix driving as well. And if you wanted to compare Max Verstappen with Ayrton Senna, for example, you could come up with quite a lot of categories and say, you know, in the wet, Senna did this, or Max does that, or fast corners, slow corners, chicanes, whatever it is. But when it comes to gear changing, and you'd say Ayrton Senna, perfect synchronization, never jumped a gear when he was downshifting, always went through all the gears, perfect use of the brake pedal against revs, heel and towing. Max Verstappen, you just have a big question mark, wouldn't you? Because we don't know.
How it's going.
Probably never driven a manual shift car. Just like I just described. And I think that's a shame because, you know, Ayrton would have said and did say several times to me, you know, gear changing is a real part of the art. And if he misses a gear, it's like playing a wrong note on a piano. And it's sad that that's gone away, I think, from the repertoire of a great Grand Prix driver. And we could easily bring it back just by bringing back manual transmissions. I think the problem with it is that a lot of people would say, oh, well, then we'll have a lot of over revving and the engines will blow up and we're trying to save money and we only have 3 engines, whatever it is. Well, you know, I would say, I'm not in any way an expert here. I'd say I'd be surprised if the software designers out there can't come up with something that would prevent engine damage in the case of a missed shift. What we want is the penalty of a missed shift, which is obviously the car hesitating on acceleration and the guy behind getting an opportunity, which is what used to happen all the time. And a lot of the races were won and lost by the driver with the best gear changing or the worst gear changing. And I'd love to see that come back. I don't think it will, as I say, because Formula One's very bad at going backwards. It only likes to go forwards or be seen to be going forwards.
Oh, I love what you said there, Peter. You're an absolute legend, mate. I could harp on for another 60 minutes, but you've been more than generous with your time. Peddlers, do me a favour, go and, like and subscribe, obviously, to Cameron F1, but immediately after that, go and check out some of Peter Windsor's incredible videos on YouTube.
Come on, that's enough.
Peter, you're far too kind
to
turn.
You do a great job too, mate, and thank you so much.
Thank you, mate. I'm just
for asking me to join your show.
Just trying to get in your slipstream, Mr. Windsor. Also, final port of call. Check out Peter Windsor on Twitch, doing incredible monologues on there, nearly daily at one point there for a couple of weeks. Peter, bloody Nora, and cop yourself some Peter Windsor merch as well. Links underneath every single video. Peter, as always, sir, you've been an absolute legend. I could talk to you for another 60, 90, 120 minutes.
Do it again very soon, eh?
Absolutely. Well, any time you've got a cheeky 30 minutes. Thank you as always. I appreciate you, sir. Thanks for the time.
Thank you.